Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to try and give you a fairly succinct presentation of the model I built with my co-author Leo Portal in a book we published a few months ago now. The aim is ambitious, you might say presumptuous, but it's to find a model that in fact explains the whole problem of the political cleavage and predicts its evolution, that explains its past evolution, and also explains current evolutions, that sheds light on the questions of whether this is the end of the left-right cleavage or not, why there is a populist moment. These are the things we're trying to shed light on. The central idea, if you like, is that at the very start, in the introduction to this colloquium, the question was posed, is one dimension enough from the extreme right to the extreme left, or vice versa, to sum up and explain what it is to be populist, to summarize and explain the political divide in its entirety? My answer to this question is yes, provided that we're talking about a dynamic, evolving dimension, and that we're able to distinguish between what I call political sensibilities and political ideas, since what lies at the heart of our model is the idea that ideas are never right or left. They travel along the political divide, and I'll come back to this. So the fundamental idea is that the cleavage is in fact a vector, the vector for adapting the political order to the underlying socio-economic order progressively through permanent compromise. And the median point, the dividing axis of political society, is what we call the established order, i.e., all that characterizes a society at a given moment: power relations, production relations, the distribution of wealth, the distribution of prestige, be it religious, intellectual, etc. All these elements are part of the established order, all these elements of division and definition within a society. And so our idea is that from one extreme to the other, the political cleavage is divided in relation to this established order. And we have four categories, which are the four classic categories. There's the extreme right, the extreme right, the extreme left, and the extreme left. What do we make coincide? I think Mr. Parenteau will agree with me, since it's an idea that's very close to his book, which we're quoting, even if we're changing the word, since he's talking about reformists, where we're talking about progressives. But the idea is that on the far right are the reactionaries, on the right the conservatives, on the left the progressives, and on the far left what we call the revolutionaries. All position themselves in relation to the established order. Reactionaries are those who think it was better before, i.e. those who are nostalgic for the economic, social, and moral order of the past, and who believe that the existing order is illegitimate and that we must return to the haunted status quo. On the right, there are the conservatives, those who generally think that things are well arranged as they are, and that if we change things, they're likely to be worse, to deteriorate society rather than improve it. It's a bit like the pessimist camp, if you like. On the left, the progressives believe that the state of society can be improved by making a few reforms, but these are people who don't think that the whole framework has to be broken, at least that it has to be preserved, but that change will always be preferable to simply accepting the current state of society. And on the extreme left are the revolutionaries, i.e. those who believe that the current system is bad, that it's based on bad principles, and that the previous order was just as bad or worse, and so a completely new model must be introduced, which will generally seek to be ideal, quite simply because it constitutes a social class. We'll come back to this later, which generally doesn't refer to a past order, because it's a new social class for different reasons. So first of all, let's recall how all this is structured. This is my second slide. This is what all studies show on a global scale in all countries where there is a constituted political community, i.e. any society that has gone beyond the simple tribal domain, below which there is no real political debate, the concerns are different, and where we have roughly 3/3, 1/3 divided between the two extremes for half, i.e. 15% to the extreme left, 15% to the extreme right, or a sixth if you prefer, and then there's what's called the left and what's called the right, each for a large third. This distribution is doubly proven. Firstly, it's empirically proven, since, as I said, it's what emerges from studies of how people themselves place themselves on the political divide. And secondly, it's logically proven, and there always is one anyway. It's quite logical that people should distribute themselves around this established order equally. Otherwise, it would mean that it's an unstable order, and in general, it would mean that it would never have taken hold in the first place. So that's why we observe this. and the logic is consistent with empirical observation. My third slide shows you the empirical proof, because that's what it shows if you can put it up. It shows how people are distributed in a number of major countries, and of course there's a site where you can go and look at all that. I gave the references in my book. Could we show you the third slide if possible? Here it is. So you see, on the right hand side you have to forget the last two columns, because these are the people who don't know or who don't express an opinion, and who are generally distributed quite simply in the middle. But on the others, no, it was the previous slide, you should have left it a little. So you have this normal distribution in a whole bunch of countries and major countries today: France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Russia, Spain, Turkey, and the UK. So how do people define themselves politically? This is my fourth slide that you have on the screen. And this fourth one, no, it's the one that was very good. It comes from, this is a figure that's not in our book. It comes from David Hutchman's book called Our Political. I can't remember the full title. It's Our Political Placement, which actually seeks to understand from an evolutionary psychology point of view what makes people right or left. So that's part of the explanation, because what we see, what's very interesting in the studies that present, which are based on the American electorate, I think it must be valid for just about any electorate because it's logical, is that you have, it's distinguished into four parts. You have, which are about 4/4, you have those who are purely ideological, i.e. who place themselves according to what they consider to be their thinking, their conviction. You have those who place themselves group benefit according to what they consider to be their personal interest. You have those who follow the spirit of the times. And finally, you have the people who don't know why they place themselves. What's very interesting is that, in fact, the distribution is done by half, i.e. on the one hand, you have those who are politically placed in a relatively conscious way, whether because they have studied their own interests or because they are people who have thought deeply and formed a conviction that can sometimes be totally detached from their own personal interests. So it's not necessarily class thinking. And for the other half, it's people who are essentially going to place themselves in a relatively instinctive way. And indeed, that's what we see, is that in most societies, there are people who are quite simply conservative by nature, people who don't like things to change, people who don't like things to change, who like being in an environment to which they're accustomed, and people who, on the contrary, like things to change, whether in one direction or another. And these people will either position themselves against their own interests, or at any rate without taking their interests into account, or quite simply because their political positioning will not have a direct influence on their economic and social position, because the ideas defended are not likely to affect them or not enough to make a difference. So we can move on to the next slide if you like. The aim of this slide is to try and understand how those who are thinking and those who are consciously positioning themselves are positioning themselves, because in fact they are the ones who will create the reality of the political divide, and all the people who are not thinking at all, I'm telling you, are positioning themselves rather by instinct. They will be more like followers in this movement. Once again, on the right, we find people who are what I call satisfied, i.e. a population that is generally older and more economically established, who have an interest in preserving the system and who will naturally be concerned about any possible change. That's why these are people who are rather pessimistic, who have a tendency towards declinism, because they think that any change is likely to affect them negatively. And that's why the traditional values that are accorded, which are less values, I'd like to say, than concerns, because it's often not reflected. It's even more underlying. They're really concerns, sensitivities, out of authority, tradition, respect for institutions, are those of this part of the population of the political body. Population of the body politic. On the left, what I'd call the dissatisfied, a population that is inversely younger and less settled overall. I'm not saying that the old are right-wing and the young are left-wing. They're agglomerates. So this population thinks it can generally benefit from reforms and is naturally critical of what is traditionally done. They are optimistic in the sense that they are enterprising in the direction of change, believing that taking action will change things for the better. Her discourse is effectively idealistic because it necessarily refers to something that doesn't exist. since she's trying to move things towards a vision that isn't yet the real thing, since the real thing is the established order. And so she's a protester since she's opposed to this established order. And at the extremes, there are those I call the declassed and the excluded, i.e. those who would not have gained much from a brutal reversal of the situation, a paradigm shift, and who are divided up according to the origin of their situation as excluded from the system. In other words, you've got the déclassés, those who once belonged to a privileged population and have been downgraded. They tend to be on the extreme right. This is the case, for example, of the old regime nobility who lost their prerogatives during the 19th century, and it's very much the case today of the white working class population in Europe or the United States, the so-called little whites who have moved from the left or even the extreme communist and working class left to the extreme right, because they feel that having reached a kind of apogee in terms of the rights and economic situation they enjoyed at the end of the 20th century, they are now being downgraded and threatened. And on the extreme left, there are those who belong to an excluded population of new origin and who will therefore be on the extreme left. Now, a population of new origin doesn't necessarily mean a population that has arrived. It can be a class. So, for example, workers in the 19th century are a new class that didn't exist before, that didn't exist under the Ancien regime. There were a few small factory workers, but it was the emergence of industry that really gave rise to a working class. And today, it's mainly people of immigrant origin, whether in Europe or the United States. Next slide. This is extremely important, as we'll see later when we come to the question of populism. There are two subclasses that can be created, or two subsets that can be created: the satisfied and the dissatisfied. The simple leftists and the rightists, i.e. the progressives and the conservatives, form the category of what I call conformists, i.e. those who believe that the established order in the broadest sense is in any case globally legitimate. They may want to keep it as it is or criticize it in order to change it, but they don't consider it illegitimate. They don't want to break everything. They don't want to break the existing framework in any case. So it's the group of moderates I call conformists, those who think the system should be conformed to, and exclude and downgrade them together. They form the category of anti-conformists who challenge the legitimacy of the established order and who can be found on this subject. And from that point of view, I'm close to Ferracheval's model, which was mentioned at the start of our symposium, and which reminds us of the proximity that can exist between the extreme right and the extreme left. I think I talk again. So once we've understood that, and we've understood how the body politic is structured, and here we haven't yet talked about ideas, we're just talking about people's situations, we can tackle the question of the variation in meaning, that is, the way in which ideas move from left to right. It's not an idea I invented. It was first formulated by Albert Thibaudet, who spoke of the synestrogie movement, a term that was also mentioned in the introduction. And what we want to show is that, in fact, it applies everywhere. So the idea, it's simple and follows on from what I said earlier, is that from the moment the body politic becomes cliquish in relation to an established order, and political practice modifies the established order. What is political practice? It's simply the fact that day by day and over time, the members of the body politic, and in particular the moderates of both camps, right and left, make compromises that bring into the established order the demands that come essentially from the left, because this is the most dynamic component. This is simply the direction in which socio-economic change is taking place. And so, to keep up with this dynamic, the right, via its reformist components capable of negotiating compromises with moderates, accepts changes that gradually become part of the established order and become the established order. And as soon as a reform has been accepted by the conservatives, it in turn becomes the established order. That's why it's very rare for conservatives to go back on reforms, such as societal reforms, and why, for example, no moderate right-wing party in countries that have accepted gay marriage claims to go back on gay marriage. Those who do claim to be going back on it are the reactionaries, so they tend to have a far-right connotation. Conservatives, once they've got the hang of it, simply keep it. So that's a slippery slope and doesn't allow for a one-way evolution over the long term. And ideas, i.e. doctrines and the practical measures that doctrines propose as solutions to problems encountered, move along the spectrum of sensitivities. We've already talked about liberalism, which was extreme left-wing at the end of the 18th century and which slowly moved to the right. The same is true of secularism, for example. Secularism, which was an extreme left-wing idea at the beginning of the 20th century from the hard left has now become a right-wing idea. So that's how ideas gradually shift, simply because once it's gone to the right, the conservatives keep it, but the left-wing population is constantly renewing itself and therefore has new aspirations which it will push and which can sometimes end up being contrary to what the left-wing population had wanted 100 years before. So there's no permanence of ideas on either side of the divide. That's an illusion forged by our experience and by the fact that it's a relatively slow-moving movement, that we've been thinking about these issues ever since the name left-right cleavage was first coined for this long-term phenomenon. So over the last 200 years, there's actually been a lot of, we have the impression that there is relative stagnation, but then again, it's quite crazy if we take a certain number of specific examples, as I said, secularism and so on. So the next slide shows you a simple diagram that summarizes how things work. You see the description I gave of this political cleavage in the shape of a hemicycle, which is often the parliamentary distribution of these tendencies. You see, it summarizes that the left and the right are in what we call the conformists, the far left and the far right are in the anti-conformist category, and you have the direction of circulation of ideas, which goes from the far left to the far right. So that's how this transmission of ideas, this dynamism takes place. And that's what makes it possible in the long term to ensure that the established order, particularly in political matters, corresponds to the evolution of society, since little by little, old ideas or ideas that correspond to dying sociological or economic realities. Once again, for example, the landed aristocracy of the ancien regime are replaced by new ones. Well, from the moment this class gradually disappears, its political weight totally disappears, and it disappears from the established order, while the political compromise has to be updated with the social classes that are emerging. For example, the very powerful working class of the 19th and 20th centuries and today's immigrant populations. That's how turnover takes place, how ideas that no longer correspond to social foundations are gradually eliminated, and that's why social perception takes precedence over ideas. I'm one of those people who believe that ideas don't rule the world. The world is ruled by the underlying realities that ideas come to dress up. I'll come back to this a little later to explain how ideas are expressed differently when they're on the right and when they're on the left. But first, I'd like to make a point about the way ideas circulate, which sheds light on the issues of elitism and populism. Because the movement of ideas from left to right is not a continuous phenomenon from left to right, but rather a wave of doctrine. So, as I was saying, in the 19th and 20th centuries, in the 19th century it was Republican liberalism and the idea of the republic that prevailed, bourgeois republicanism that prevailed, that represented the force of the left. And it wasn't until the beginning of the 20th century that major workers' parties appeared, notably the French section of the Workers' International in 2005, which renewed the cleavage and pushed the Republicans towards the center and to the right as far as liberalism was concerned. And so things happen in waves. And what's extremely interesting is that, in fact, the left, and Bobbio was right in this sense when he said that the left was the quest for equality, is true, but it's not a purely ideological and abstract quest for equality. In reality, it's more the quest for inclusion. And why is that? Because that's what drives the left, which does indeed have this open, inclusive mentality, is to seek every time to include the new class of excluded people that has emerged in the political compromise of society. The new excluded class was the one that wasn't there when the established order was put in place. So in that sense, it's a quest for equality, but not so much a quest for universal equality. Talking about equality is the way we dress up the fact that we simply have a power relationship with a force that finds itself outside the established order and wants to make its place in it, so it's going to try to take it. This ties in with what one of Nicolin's professors was saying earlier, when he said that there was this desire to take places. But this doesn't just concern a small number of people, it's a part of society as a whole that wants to take its place in the established political order. So we have long successive sequences like this, and there are times when the divide weakens. Why does it weaken? It's the moment when an excluded class has achieved most of what it wanted, when when it succeeds in having the political compromise renegotiated to its advantage and thus integrated into it. And when this happens, the cleavage that has long dictated political life naturally loses its force, because as compromise has been introduced into society, people have come to agree. It's a compromise on which people agree, so it's no longer contested. And this means that the political division of society is weakening, or at least it's weakening around the established order. But this has the following politico-social effect. In the population, in any political population, there are always two permanently existing tendencies. The tendency that I call populist, but which is the meaning generally given to it, is that of being the small against the big, the people against the people in charge, the elites or those who claim to know. And these populists are at the extremes. And why? Simply because they are non-conformist. They're people who generally don't accept the legitimacy of the existing order, the existing political order, the elites and institutions. Do you agree? That's why they're dégagistes. All tendencies exist all the time. This distrust of the elites is notably because the extremes, generally speaking, are more popular. On average, this doesn't mean that there aren't highly educated people at the extremes, but on the whole, these are more popular categories than in the center, notably for sociological reasons, because it's the people who are least educated in the system who are most likely to be radically opposed to it. Those who are educated and adhere to the norms of the system are more likely to be found in the center or among the moderate, i.e., those who are integrated into the system and have a vested interest in seeing them lose. This is not the case for those who have been downgraded or excluded for different reasons. But this populist tendency is matched by another tendency, which in reality is almost the primary one, and that's the elitist tendency. So I know that, and this may be discussed tomorrow by another speaker, I don't like the term anti-populism to designate elitism, because it implies that populism would come first and that elitism would be some kind of reaction to populism, when in fact it's the other way around. Populism is a reaction to elitism, or at least the rise of populism. The phenomenon that worries elites is a reaction to elitism. What in fact is elitism? It's the intellectual expression of the tendency of moderates to seek to find themselves among themselves, quite simply because if you look at the elites, whether on the right or the left, conservative or progressive, they are the same elites. They are elites who are close to each other, who share the same backgrounds, who frequent the same circles, who are generally at the head of the state. It's the most educated, the richest, the most powerful, and sometimes the narrowest part of the population. And so, socially, there is an effect in this part of the population. There is a political effect, which is the tendency to recognize each other and share the same codes. And to put it in almost vulgar terms, from many points of view, a right-wing bourgeois will feel closer to a left-wing bourgeois than to a left-wing or right-wing populist. That's the social phenomenon. But this has political implications, because from the moment when moderates are no longer divided by the cleavage because they've spent 50 years compromising and getting along, valuing and sleeping with a particular order. Today, for example, the welfare state, which for several decades now has addressed most of the concerns of working-class people since the end of the 19th century. Or again, at the end of the 19th century, all those elites who had finally rallied to the idea of the Republic, rallying to the Third Republic, a large part of the right, which had long been hostile. So on the whole, everyone agreed on the Republic, and it no longer posed any questions at that point. At that point, the cleavage was no longer there to create a division between the two camps of elites, each of which was the spokesperson for the people of the right and the people of the left. And so these elites tended to unite around this idea of elitism, no longer being able to see what differentiated them ideologically any more than what differentiated them socially from the base of their camp, i.e., what differentiates the right-wing bourgeois from the right-wing people, what differentiates the left-wing bourgeois from the left-wing people, the bourgeois or the aristocrat, depending on the area you're talking about. And so at that point, an elitist phenomenon appears. What is this elitist phenomenon? It's the tendency, the temptation to no longer accept the rules of democracy, to no longer accept democratic debate because it's divisive. It's the tendency to seek consensus, the arrangement between people in good company, and to dismiss with a frown or a twitch of the nose any idea that is too divisive. And that's why more and more, and we're noticing this in the West, as is the case on TV shows, anyone who comes up with a slightly divisive thought will quickly be accused of being divisive. 30 years ago, this would not have been the case. 30 years ago, people would have called it debate. But debate has become relatively inadmissible, a rather archetypal case is the Germany of Angela Merkel, who has just left office but who, for 15 years, reigned over the governing parties of the right and left, the SPD and the CDU-CSU, in a centrist coalition of what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing in France called the government of 2 out of 3 Frenchmen, and what the all-too-familiar French thinker Fabrice Boutillon calls centrism by excluding the extremes. In contrast, populism is often centrism, the addition of extremes. When we reach this phase where there is no longer an ideological divide, we return to a kind of social divide between the elites and the people, between those who want to govern, between moderate people and those who are totally hostile to this order. And we have a plethora of examples. You have the famous 2005 referendum in France on the European Constitution, where the governing parties on both the right and the left were in favor of the yes to the Constitution, while the extremes were against it. And it was the no side that won. It was a truly extreme alliance. This was the case with the Yellow Vests revolt in France, who were quickly accused by the powers that be of being precisely red-browns. The same authorities who, when the COVID crisis erupted, claimed to be ruled by scientists by setting up a scientific committee, while accusing those with a contrary opinion of scientific populism, and in particular people on the extreme right and left who, in France, were seduced by the personality of Professor Didier Raoult, who was at the origin of a great controversy and still is in France. And it's a controversy of a political nature that still exists. As populism brings together the left and the right, the case of the alliance between the Lega and the Cinque Stelle movement in Italy has also been cited, which is of the same order. So what we need to understand is that this phenomenon of the rise of populism appears in a phase, what I call a unanimist phase, i.e. a moment when the ideological divide that had structured political relations for roughly a century is running out of steam. And we often tend to think that this means the end of the left-right divide. That's what a lot of people say, but it's not true. It's not the end of the left-right divide. It's a phase preceding an ideological shift that should lead to the emergence of a new cleavage. That's what we saw at the end of the 19th century. It's worth remembering that at the end of the 19th century in France, at the very moment when there was this Republican unanimity, there was the Boulogne crisis. There was the Boulangiste crisis. What was the Boulangiste crisis? It was General Boulanger who almost came to power and overthrew the Republic, and who had the peculiarity of being supported by both monarchists and Bonapartists. So people on the right, i.e. the hard right, and the anarcho-socialists, i.e. people on the far left. The far left felt abandoned by the Republicans they had long supported, the radical Republicans, and the far right still refused to accept the arrival of the Republic. So these were people who had completely different reasons for hating the Republic, but who shared General Boulanger's candidacy. And that's why all this went on for 15, 20 years or so, until the arrival, once again, of the SFIO and a genuine left-wing workers' party, which then absorbed the anarchist workers' readership as well, and structured the left throughout the 20th century. So, during this pre-changeover phase, during this transitional phase between one cleavage and another, we have an alternative cleavage phase that is temporary and unstable between conformists and anti-conformists. Next slide, which shows you exactly what I've just been talking about, i.e. how in a normal cleavage you can see revolutionary, progressive, conservative, and shareholder. And I'd like to show you the next image, please. So that's the normal cleavage, revolutionary, progressive, conservative, and shareholder. When this cleavage is exhausted, the elites begin to gather together, giving rise to elitism, that is, a mode of government in which alternation in fact no longer means anything. And the people soon realize this, both on the right and on the left. They realize that things no longer move because the people who are in government, who head the governing parties and who get elected for several decades in a row, don't change anything because they agree with each other on everything, even if their voters don't agree on everything. And so, in the end, this leads to the rise of populism on both the left and the right, and that's the phenomenon we're witnessing. And I think if it's a phenomenon that's often misunderstood, it's because intellectuals need to do a little introspection, as we're generally people who belong to the moderates, to the established order, because we have positions, because we're part of the most educated bangs of the population. Well, we tend to look at populism as if it were a foreign phenomenon, something that just appears, which is abnormal, whereas we're part of normality. And we need to make the effort to introspect and understand that there's also an elitist side to it, and that it pre-exists this rise in populism and even provokes it. So the next slide is what I was just telling you. I'm sorry I'm a little ahead of schedule on my slides, but it'll give you a good idea of what's going on. Elitism is really about radicalism and moderation. It's the idea that moderates become radicalized. They say we're moderates, the others trust science. For example, we trust studies, we trust the committee, whatever. This is the advent of technocracy. Technocracy as a mode of government is typically elitist in the political sense of the term. So it's the rejection of positivist extremism, it's the desire for consensus, it's the idea, the alternative there is no, the idea that we only take solutions that work, that everything is just a technical matter of debate and budget lines, and that's what we should talk about when we're serious people, and we shouldn't talk about big ideas, whether it's the nation, miscegenation, national identity, racial exclusion, all these things that are seen as divisive, whereas there's nothing that can't be settled with a small quota or a small budget line. So there you have it. I'm not going to repeat what I've already said. We can move on to the next slide, which is also important to finish understanding. So ideas move from left to right, and naturally when an idea moves, it takes on a different coloring, a different tone, depending on where it's placed. It doesn't have the same meaning. On the left, in line with left-wing thinking, they tend to seek change and expansion, whereas on the right, the will to conserve means preservation, cautious withdrawal, and resistance. For example, left-wing nationalism has a missionary or even messianic dimension. It's revolutionary nationalism, the desire to export a model, either the model of revolution at the time of the French Revolution or the light of civilization at the time of colonization. Conversely, on the right, nationalism is marked by a desire to withdraw into oneself. It's an identitarianism, it's the fear of disappearing, and therefore it's the preservation of heritage and identity, which we see a lot of at the moment. Secularism, or laicite as a driving force, when it was on the left, was intended to free individuals from traditional beliefs, because religion was seen as an obstacle to personal development and intellectual emancipation, whereas secularism on the right was designed to protect individuals from the hegemonic pretensions of new beliefs. In a nutshell, left-wing secularism was built against the authority of the established Catholic Church, for example in France, whereas right-wing secularism today is a reaction and defense against the rise of Muslim belief in the Western world, particularly in France. Left-wing liberalism sought the emancipation of individuals, the abolition of traditional social determinisms, whereas right-wing liberalism is more concerned with the defense of existing freedoms, acquired freedoms, their preservation, the defense of customs and traditions, insofar as, precisely, they are freedoms. The idea that customs are freedoms is a very old one, dating back to the Middle Ages. The last point I'd like to address, which is extremely important for understanding and drawing up this picture of the political divide, is the three mentalities found on both the left and the right. We've taken up, abstracted, and gone beyond René Raymond's well-known ideas on the right in France. His idea was that there were three rightists: Orleanists, Legitimists, and Bonapartists, and he gave them their historical names, believing that they then had affiliation that continued in the parties of government, or of non-government for that matter, the extreme parties, right up to the 70s and 80s. So we tried to see what the reality behind this was, the fundamental reality, and above all to understand whether the same thing wasn't happening on the left. In fact, there is the same thing on the left, and that's what we're going to explain to you now. In any case, I've drawn up a table in the book, which is extremely clear. It's very simple. It's about the authority of the state. It's right and left, anarchist, authoritarian, or reformist. And here again, it's simply a question of mindset. Anarchist is someone who dislikes power. An authoritarian is someone who believes in using power. A reformist, on the other hand, is someone who believes that compromise is best. And so, depending on whether your main concern is progress or conservation, whether you're on the right or the left, you're bound to have different implications. A right-wing anarchist is someone who believes that public authority is an obstacle to conservation. And so he approaches political authority because it's an obstacle to conservation. Typically, this is the traditional Catholic who is opposed to the Republic, but who will break with power for this very reason. Legitimism in the 19th century was largely anarchist in that it referred to an old order and did not accept the legitimacy of the new. There are many people who are really anarchists in the spirit of royalism because it's a way of being an anarchist and having a reason to challenge the authority of the state. The authoritarian, when he's on the right, thinks that political authority must ensure conservation. Force must be used to preserve and to fight against progress or change. In any case, progress must be curbed. The person on the left thinks the opposite. On the contrary, Authority must forcibly destroy traditional servitudes. One example is the law separating church and state. People are sent to church and so on. So you have to force progress. And finally, there are the reformists. The reformists are those on both sides who think that the framework must be maintained, which doesn't exactly correspond to the moderates. This is very important. That's why I've put the diagram below. I realize that the tables aren't there. Is this slide number 12? Isn't it number 12? Because it's a table and a diagram. It would be nice to find it again. Wait, I'll continue. So, it's not an exact match. The idea is that overall, reformists are essentially found in the center. And among moderates, you don't find reformists among the extremes for logical reasons. When you're willing to compromise, you're not among the radicals. On the other hand, the further you go to the extremes, the more you find anarchists and authoritarians in roughly equal proportions. And at the extremes, that's all you get, more anarchists and authoritarians, whether on the right or the left. And what's interesting is that these are people who can agree on a certain mentality. In particular, left-wing anarchists and right-wing anarchists can find common ground in their criticism of the system. Authoritarians can find themselves in the impression that the state no longer has any strength. That's it. Thanks for the image. That the state no longer has any strength, so it needs to be restored in some way, even if it's not to do the same thing. So that also explains how the two can come together. All this, well, I could have gone into more detail because it's also used to explain certain modeling attempts, what we call the RWA, LWA, right-wing authoritarianism and left-wing authoritarianism models, which divide personalities into three poles, so to speak. And in fact, depending on how you distribute these three poles, you end up with three types of personality: anarchist, authoritarian, and reformist. That's how we model this political cleavage. And once we have this model in our work, I'm not going to go into detail now, but we show on the basis of a certain number of historical examples, whether it's the history of France since the 12th century, the same for England, the history of the United States since the beginning of its history, the history of Russia since the Middle Ages, the history of Japan since medieval times, the history of ancient Rome, the history of ancient Athens. We show that this model enables us to define the political cleavage. We show that this model can explain the political evolution of societies and the shift in ideologies and the permanence of right-wing and left-wing ideas since well before the French Revolution. And we have a number of tables that show and establish that from the French Revolution onward, the moment when the right and left would have appeared, in reality, the movement is simply one of continuity. And so we're just formulating a process that has been underway for a long time and which once again affects all constituted political communities that have gone beyond the stage of tribalism or feudalism. That's why it all began around the 12th century in France, when we began to have a relative vision of what space and therefore the national community would be. This model allows us to solve all the problems, or at least we haven't submitted any yet that can't be solved by it. I hope I've presented it quickly enough, which leaves a little time for a few questions. Fabian, are you present? I'm here. Thank you very much, Philippe, for your presentation. I'm sorry I was a bit late with the slide I couldn't find. We'll have time to come back this evening, I hope, in the joint discussion and tomorrow in the round table on your general theory of cleavage, which is frankly off the beaten track. It's really original, so I really hope we'll come back to it, that it's really worth developing. So I'm going to ask Renata's question. I'll ask it in French and then translate it as is customary now. Philippe, does it make sense to talk about the left-right distinction without an underlying ideology? As a Portuguese, there's a question that still makes a frame for Professor Philippe Agoré, and to undo this feeling, we need to make direct frames without ideology at the font. The question that has been introduced at the moment by Professor Fabrice is, does it make sense to talk about the left-right distinction without underlying ideology? I think I've shown that in reality, ideologies merely illustrate and dress up underlying political, economic, and social concerns. In the final analysis, they dress up and give voice to ideologies, to political concerns that precede them. And as I said, the essential thing that dictates the cleavage is the economic and social interest of those who will formalize these ideologies and demands. Another example is the bourgeoisie in the very ancient sense of the term, in the medieval sense, i.e. the emergence of the population of towns and cities. The emergence of the medieval bourgeoisie really marked the first cleavage, as it was the first challenge to the feudal order. And this challenge to the feudal order, which was not at all ideological at its core, simply involved people beginning to realize that they could obtain freedoms by fighting against their lord, or by demanding this of the French king, or in other countries it's the same. It's the same in England and so on. So it's a purely economic and social battle. But quite quickly, these people found in the rediscovery of Roman law a ready-made ideology, which was that of the power of the prince as conceived in Roman law, which was not at all feudal, but which is a prince of subjects, and where we are not in a feudal monarchy, where we are the relatively elected king, etc. And so it was only in this way that the French king was able to take control of the world. And so it was only later, or concomitantly, that the bourgeoisie took hold of these ideas and was delighted to find in them a political corpus that enabled them to express their basic will, which was simply that of a population that realized it no longer needed the nobility to protect it because it was able to form militias and build walls around its towns. They have wealth themselves, they can afford to buy things, and so they have power, and they don't understand. And the existing political order, in fact, no longer corresponds to what they experience on a day-to-day basis, i.e. the fact that they're able to have the same standard of living as the nobility, sometimes even higher, because there's some destitute nobility, and so it's purely an economic concern, and that hasn't changed in modern times. Marxist theory came to dress up workers' concerns, which in fact found a response in practice that was almost anti-Marxist, because Marx's basic idea was the abolition of wage labor, whereas the response that was found to the workers' problem was the generalization of wage labor and the emergence of the welfare state. So it's quite the opposite, and that's why I insist what's important are the facts, the social, political, and production relationships, not the ideas. Ideas come on top, and we often make this mistake, so we tend to say socialism is left-wing, liberalism is right-wing, etc., when this is not true at all. That's really at the heart of what we're trying to explain, particularly with this model and our intellectual approach. Right then, I'm going to translate for the Portuguese speakers and scientists. Professor Fabri's answer is yes, we can make sense of the cleavage on the right without ideology, insofar as through ideology there's a criterion for making sense of this much deeper cleavage, which would be a power relationship or a relationship of force between classes. In medieval times, the bourgeois class had more weight, for example in France, against or in opposition to classical feudal society, which was previously used for the physical protection of the bourgeois, and when the bourgeois began to build a militia to protect themselves physically, they no longer needed the feudal class. In fact, there's a feeling of self-sufficiency among the bourgeois class who have tried to access more power without the protection of the vertical feudal system. Moreover, the question of the secondary character of ideology is related to the relationship of power between classes. Professor Fabri's answer was that yes, we can make sense of the cleavage on the right without ideology, insofar as there is something deeper beneath the relationship of ideological relations, which is the power relations between classes. Just to take an example given by Professor Fabri, during the French Middle Ages, there was an increase in the bourgeoisie class who decided to go beyond physical protection or the protection of feudal society in order to increase their own interests. This means that the interests of the bourgeoisie in relation to the medieval feudal vertical class were not justified in terms of ideas, concepts, and ideologies, but just in terms of head-on relations between contrasting interests. Interests are deeper than ideas or ideologies, as Professor Philippe said. Thank you, Felipe, for your answer. Unfortunately, once again, we're not going to dwell on it too much because we're running late. What we're going to do this evening is come back to your model, which is truly original, to say the least, and which at the same time will serve as a basis for tomorrow's roundtable discussion. I'd very much like to come back to the distinction you made between a classical left that promoted equality and a modern left that promotes inclusion. I think there's a huge difference between the two that's never addressed in the media, at least for you. I'd like to make an observation, as Professor Philippe says, about the confusion that now exists between a new left that will insist much more on the notion of inclusion of social minorities, or the opposite, or that this is the most important issue of equality. Here, there are two very different political concepts that could explain the confusion over the left's identity. It's a question for the GMO and for tomorrow's redundancy. Just a quick observation. I had the impression just now from the two professors, Felipe, that there's something like a substitution of two different concepts on the left. In the past, the classical left has always promoted the value of equality, as Professor Bobbio puts it exactly. Now we have something like a new left, which is trying to, the classical value of the left, i.e. equality, and is trying to do something like an exchange with another value, a modern value, i.e. inclusion. So my question is, are inclusion and equality two words for the same left, or is there a big difference? It's an interesting question, I think, for tomorrow evening and today. That's it. We're going to close the presentation now. Thank you very much, Felipe, for your very vivid presentation, which helps to clarify precisely with diagrams the left-right divide. Thank you very much, Felipe. You're welcome.